Hello everyone, this is Bantergu. So in the last class we have discussed about the statement of the problem in the second chapter. We have seen in that chapter about what is meant by statement of the problem and how do we define the statement of the problem, what are the contents of the statement of the problem, and how do we identify our objectives from the statement of the problem. These are the points that we have seen in the last class. So in today's class we are going to see about the third chapter in research methodology course. So the third chapter is about the sources and method of data collection. So first of all, let's see about the sources of data. We have two basic sources of data. One is the primary source and the other is the secondary source. So what is the primary source? Primary source is the original source of data. It is a data, it's a source which is original in its nature. So the primary sources are the elementary units in the population upon which the investigation is made. And on the other hand, what is secondary source? Secondary source is not the original source. It is a secondary source is a source of secondary data. So secondary data are originally collected by others for a different purpose. So it's a kind of ready-made data. So this one is not original in its nature. So what are the sources of secondary data? The most commonly used secondary sources are magazines. We have magazines as a source of secondary data. We have newspapers. We have journals, proceedings, websites, and other publications are sources of secondary data. With regard to primary data are originally collected by the researcher or his agents for the first time for any investigation and used by them in the statistical analysis. Primary data are those data which are collected afresh. The primary data is a fresh data which is collected now. But the secondary data is a data which was collected by other individuals or organizations for a different purpose. What are the advantages of primary data? The advantage of primary data as a primary source, it provides us with greater details. We can have great details of data from the primary one, but the secondary sources omit some part of the information. In the secondary source, the other advantage of primary data is in the secondary source there is a possibility of mistakes. But in case of primary data, we can control the quality of the data and we can avoid any kind of mistakes. And the third advantage of primary data is the primary data includes definitions of terms and units. These are the advantages of primary data. With regard to secondary data, where do we get secondary data or data which was collected by others? Where do we get them? We get them from these sources. So the central government, the state government, as well as the local governments provide us various types of secondary data. So that's one source. And various international bodies which includes the United Nations, for instance. The United Nations is an international body, the World Bank is another international body, IMF, etc. The African Union, African Development Bank, etc. All of these are international bodies. So these international bodies have various types of publications. So the publications of these international bodies are the source of secondary data. In addition, we have foreign governments providing us secondary data. We have journals, we have books, magazines, newspapers, we have reports and publications of various organizations, and we have reports of scholars in different fields. We have public records. All of these are sources of secondary data. And with regard to advantage of secondary data has the following advantage. It's economical, it saves time, So we can, if the secondary data is available, we can collect it within short period of time. And the availability of secondary data also helps us to better understand about the problem. And this secondary data can be used as a basis for comparison with the primary data. And on the other hand, what are the limitations? Secondary data has the following limitations. Secondary data may not meet one's specific needs. The secondary data may not meet our need. In terms of what? In terms of unit of analysis, in terms of the variables, in terms of accuracy, in terms of the sample size, as well as the secondary data can also be outdated one. So we need to be careful in using secondary data. Question of reliability is also one of the limitations of secondary data. And so what are the requirements that must be made to use secondary data? Before using secondary data, we need to evaluate it for its sufficiency, for its accuracy, for its quality, for reliability, for etc. So how do we evaluate? These are the points that we have to consider. First of all, the data should be available. The secondary data should be available. And that secondary data, not only availability, it should be relevant for our study purpose. It should be relevant. And we need to consider the reliability of the data. Whether the data is reliable or not, we need to check. Who collected the data? What were the sources of the data? What were they collected by using proper method? At what time they were collected? Was there any bias on the compiler? And what level of accuracy was desired? Was it achieved? All of these questions should be answered in order to clearly know about the reliability of the secondary data. So the other requirement is about the accuracy. The secondary data should be accurate. So how do we know whether the secondary data is accurate or not? We need to check it arithmetically. Sufficiency is the last point that we will see in evaluating the secondary data. The data should be sufficient for your study purpose. Before using the secondary data, you need to check whether it is sufficient or not. You may use, in terms of sample size, in terms of the number of years that the secondary data involves, we need to check its sufficiency. You may need 5 years data. You may need 10 years data for your study purpose. So whether the available data is sufficient or not, you have to check. Sufficiency is one point. With regard to the method of data collection, primary data can be collected by using various techniques. There are 3 basic techniques that we use to collect primary data. One is the interview, the other is the questionnaire, and the third one is the observation, the interview method. So the interview involves 2 individuals, at least 2 individuals, and one individual is expected to ask questions. We call him or her interviewer, and the other individual is expected to answer the questions. So this individual is known as the interviewee. So interview involves interviewer and interviewee. So with regard to the types of interviews, we have 2 types of interviews. One is a structured interview, and the other is the unstructured interview. At least we have 2 types of interviews. So what is a structured interview? The structured interview involves structured set of questions. It is highly standardized in form and content, and it involves prefixed questions. It involves prefixed language. It involves prefixed question order, and the answers are already fixed. You have to choose among alternatives. It could be yes or no alternative, or we can give a kind of categorical answers. One categorical answer is the Likert scale. Likert scale from strongly disagree up to strongly agree. We have 5 scales. So it's also one of the structured questions that we ask in structured interview. So the other is the unstructured interview. This unstructured interview, it's not pre-planned one. It is not structured. it is not ordered. So in this unstructured interview, the investigators are given some broad topics upon which they have to collect information. The respondents are free to narrate. So unstructured interview, you have to give broad topic, and on that broad topic, the interviewees narrate their experiences, or they can give stories, various types of stories. So we call it unstructured interview. And what are the guidelines to make an interview process effective? What are the guidelines? One basic thing is to have a relaxed atmosphere between the interviewer and the interviewee. So the other technique is to clarify questions by repeating the questions. So questions could be misunderstood or misinterpreted by the interviewee. So if any kind of misunderstanding or misinterpretation is there, the interviewer has to repeat the questions for better clarification. And the use of transition statements is also one technique that we use for effectiveness of an interview. We have to make the interview process conversational. And statements of understanding and interest, even we have to use our body language to communicate with the interviewee, like nodding your head and the facial expressions. So overall body language should be used so that the interviewee could be engaged more in the interviewing process. Repeating the respondent's reply could also help. How it helps? It may stimulate further thought in the mind of the interviewee. And asking neutral questions is another key aspect of the interview process. The interviewer is expected to be neutral in the interviewing process. So how the interviewer keeps himself neutral? By using such neutral questions. Can you tell me more? Anything else? Why do you think like this? These are very neutral questions. So the interviewer is expected to use such neutral questions. And the other thing is, interview process has its own bias, as well as it involves what? Cost, high cost. As compared to the questionnaire technique, the interviewing process involves high cost. So these are the two basic problems of the interview method. And the other is the questionnaire. The questionnaire, how does the questionnaire method differs from the interview technique? In case of interview technique, there is a person to ask and there is a person to respond. But in case of questionnaire, there is no a person to ask. Instead, there is only a question written on a paper or in soft copy form. So the questionnaire has to be filled by the respondents. And this questionnaire has its own advantage as well as disadvantage. As compared to the interview technique, the questionnaire technique involves lower costs. Standardization is one advantage. And the anonymity or the privacy of the respondent is better in case of questionnaire than the interview. With regard to the disadvantage, the no returns or the person who took the questionnaire may not return it to us. So no returns are one of the disadvantage. The misinterpretation, because of the absence of an individual to clarify, there could be misinterpretation of the questions. And the validity problems. The validity of the questionnaire technique is also in question. So these are the disadvantage. And the last technique of method of primary data collection is the direct observation. What are the direct observation? It involves what? Observation by the investigator. The investigator is not asking anyone. Unlike the questionnaire, unlike the interview method, the investigator is not asking specific individuals. Instead, the investigator in this case is expected to observe the surroundings of the community, the organization, or the individual, whatever the unit of analysis is. So the direct observation technique has its own advantage as well as disadvantage. One advantage of the direct observation technique is it avoids respondent filtering. In case of questionnaire and interview, there is a respondent filtering problem. So in this case, in case of direct observation, we have no such problem. And the other is original information can be collected by using this direct observation technique. And the direct observation technique is less restrictive as compared to the other two techniques. And the final one is there is no interviewer's bias. The direct observation technique doesn't involve bias. With regard to the limitation of the direct observation is the limitation. Direct observation by its very nature is a slow process. Because of its slowness, it's also expensive as compared to the questionnaire and the interview technique. And the observation is limited as a way to learn. The observation technique only tells us about the things that are present. It doesn't tell us about anything which is on the past. So these are the disadvantages or the limitations of direct observation. So to recap our lesson, in today's class we have discussed about the types and the sources of data. I hope you have found an important point in this chapter. So next we'll see the fourth chapter. So thank you for attending, and